So today is all about note-to-note counterpoint, which we also call first species counterpoint. So in the Baroque era, right, beginners would learn counterpoint in steps by the species method, beginning in the simplest style in 2 parts and adding complexity until they were writing in 4 parts or more. So essentially, when people are learning how to compose, the first step is learning counterpoint with 2 voices. All right. Now, when we're talking about counterpoint, there are 2 lines. There's the counterpoint line, and then there's the cantus firmus. The cantus firmus is a given line, which is typically in the bass, but it isn't always, right? Composers are going to write another voice above it, which is the counterpoint. The cantus firmus cannot be changed. So essentially, the cantus firmus is 1 line of music. You can't change it. You can't add accidentals to it. It is what it is. You have to write your counterpoint above that cantus firmus. All right, the simplest style of counterpoint is first species. First species counterpoint is when each note of the cantus firmus is matched in length to the notes in the upper voices. All that means is if you have a cantus firmus full of whole notes, the counterpoint also has to be whole notes. The notes have to change at the same time. So all of the notes in both voices are going to be of the same note length. Both parts move at the same time to the next harmony. Questions on this? All right, so melodic intervals are connected by step, skip, or leap. A step is a whole step or a half step, right? You're just moving to the very next note. A skip is going to be a third, so you're going to, quite literally skip 1 note and go to the next one. A leap is a fourth or more. Anything larger than a third is going to be a leap. Yes. C to D is going to be a step. C to E would be a skip. C to F or anything bigger than that would be a leap. So there are 2 types of motion when you're writing counterpoint. Motion just means how the notes move. There's conjunct motion, which is a melodic line that moves primarily by step. We also call that stepwise motion. And then there's disjunct motion, which is when the line moves primarily by skip or leap, right? So, I don't have the piano turned on, but if, like a scale, for example, that's stepwise motion because you're going up by step. A scale in thirds would be disjunct motion because you're skipping. You're doing all skips. Does that make sense? Good contrapuntal lines mostly use conjunct motion. Melodic skips or leaps should be consonant. So thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, octaves should all be perfect, major, or minor. Okay? But again, for the most part, you're going to want stepwise motion to give you the strongest counterpoint. Dissonant melodic intervals, larger than a second, are not permitted in first species counterpoint. In other words, a seventh, you typically wouldn't see that in first species counterpoint. You want to aim for a line with good shape, with 1 or 2 high or low points, right? Avoid using the same note too many times. Larger intervals create a dramatic effect and must be treated carefully. They create a climax. Right? So you don't want to put like a very large interval like an octave or a tenth at the very beginning of your counterpoint because that's where the climax is going to be. You want to save that closer to the end or wherever you want to place the climax. You can include 1 leap larger than a fourth in first species counterpoint. Where possible, you should approach the leap by step in the opposite direction. So for example, if you have a descending step, you could follow that by an ascending leap. If you have an ascending step, you'd want to follow it by a descending leap and then change direction in the next note, which I'll show you a couple examples in a minute or 2. So if we look at this line right here, we have the bottom line in the bass, which is our cantus firmus, and then we have our counterpoint, up at the top. So, as you can see, what we've done here is we've written the interval between the top note and the bottom note. So we start with an octave, you know, a sixth. If you look here, this goes down by step, that goes up by step. So in both voices, that's stepwise motion. All right. Next one, we shrink the sixth down to a third. This goes up by step. However, this one goes down by a skip. So this is disjunct motion. Skip, skip, step, etc. So if you're moving to the very next line or space, it's going to be a step. If you skip one, that's a skip, and then anything greater than that is a leap. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yep. Anything larger than a step is going to be disjunct motion. All right. If we look at here, this is what I was talking about. You know, following or coming from a step to a leap and how you set up a leap and everything like that. So here we have stepwise motion going up. We have G to A, that's stepwise motion ascending. We follow that by a skip descending. And then we kept going with that. And then follow the skips with stepwise ascending. Does that make sense? So, to create a strong melodic line, you want to avoid leaps preceded or followed by a skip in the same direction. Right? So you want to have a constantly moving line. You don't want to keep having skips and leaps in the same direction because you could either make your intervals too far apart or too close together. All right? And you don't really want to have more than 2 skips or leaps in a row. Both the cantus firmus and the counterpoint should start and end on the tonic. So if I give you 12 bars of cantus firmus to write your counterpoint above, your first note and your last note should be the tonic, which again is the first of whatever scale we're in. In general, only notes diatonic to the key should appear, so you shouldn't really have to add any accidentals to the counterpoint. If a flat 6 and flat 7 appear in the cantus firmus near the close, the possibility of a clash between the scale degrees occurs, which is called a cross relation, which I'll show you in a picture. To analyze harmonic intervals between the upper and lower parts, you would only write the interval size, not the quality, except for augmented and diminished intervals. You always want to notate augmented and diminished intervals. All right. You also want to reduce compound intervals larger than a tenth to within the same octave. So if you have an interval between the two voices that's an 11th, you would simplify that compound interval to a 4th. Right? So you can write anything up to a 10th, anything larger than that. For the interval size, you would just write, you know, a simple interval. So on the example below, label the harmonic intervals between the staves, label any skips or leaps between the two melody pitches in either part with brackets, and beneath the score, circle the appropriate word that describes the predominant type of motion for predominant, not predominant, type of motion for each part. So our first one's labeled for us. We have a unison. Next up, we have a B to a D. What interval is that? B up to D is a third. Then we have A up to F, which is a sixth. We have C up to E, which is a third. D up to F, also a third. C up to G, fifth. We have F up to A. Is it a third? Why is it a third? Why is f up to a third? Why is this f up to that a third? It's a tenth. Good. We have G up to G, which is an octave. We have G up to E, which is a sixth, I heard. We have B up to D again, which is a third, and then we have a unison. So in terms of interval size, is there anything wrong with these intervals? Are they all consonant? Are there any dissonant intervals? That's not over a tenth, that is a tenth. So we have thirds, sixths, fifths, octaves, and unisons. So everything here is consonant. So we're good. All right, now let's analyze the motion. So we're going to focus on the cantus firmus, which actually is not in the bass. It is, if you see right here, CF, cantus firmus, is actually in the upper voice. So let's analyze the motion here. We have C up to D. Is that step, skip, or leap? Step. D up to F. What is it? Skip. We have F down to E. Step. E up to F. Step. We have F up to G, which is another step. G up to A. We have, yep. And then step. So, primarily in the cantus firmus, is it conjunct or disjunct motion? Raise your hand for conjunct. Raise your hand for disjunct. Remember, conjunct just means stepwise motion. For the most part, everything in our cantus firmus is step. So it's conjunct motion. Let's analyze the counterpoint in the lower voice. C down to B. B down to A. B up to C. C up to D. D down to C. C down to F. Leap. F up to G. Step. G to G. Doesn't really apply because it's the same note. And then G up to B. Skip. And then step. So in our counterpoint, is it primarily conjunct or disjunct motion? Conjunct. So, is this a strongly written line of counterpoint? It is. So we mostly have stepwise motion. Skips and leaps, yeah. Questions on that? Okay, sure. Questions? We go to move on? All right, so contrary motion is when the two parts move in opposite directions. This is the preferred type of motion because it gives voices the most independence and balance. Parallel motion is when both parts move in the same direction by the same interval. This is allowed between imperfect consonants, but not between perfect consonances. Similar motion is when both parts move in the same direction, but not by the same interval. Similar motion may be used freely except when approaching a perfect interval, where it is acceptable if the upper part moves by step. Oblique motion is when one part repeats or sustains a single pitch. The other moves by leap, skip, or step. Because oblique motion requires one part to be static, this type, though acceptable, is not desired. Yeah. All right, so if we look at this right here, just to identify the different types of motions, it's already labeled it out for us. We have contrary motion. We have contrary motion. Here, this is what we call parallel motion. Why is this parallel instead of similar? Because the interval stays the same. Very good. So both parts move in the same direction, but they move in a way that the interval stays the same. So that is what we call parallel motion. Parallel motion is never allowed for perfect intervals. So if it's a fourth, a fifth, an octave, you can never have parallel motion. That is forbidden. That's like one of the biggest rules. All right. We have contrary motion. We have contrary motion. Parallel motion in a third, which is okay. Contrary motion. Similar motion. Contrary motion. Or actually, down here it's oblique motion because the bottom note stays the same. And then contrary motion. Because it's just the rules. No, not in first species counterpoint, they're not. So these rules that we're learning are like old and don't really matter anymore, but this is first species counterpoint, so you do have to follow the rules. You can't break the rules for first species counterpoint. It won't sound ugly, it's just not the most pleasing to the ear to have parallel perfect intervals. Yeah. When we're done, I have to get the piano all set up. All right, so down below, we are going to write the interval numbers between the staves, and then we're going to identify the motion between these intervals as contrary, similar, or oblique, or parallel by writing the appropriate letter below the staff. All right, so first up, we have an E up to a G. It's not a third. It's a tenth. Because if it were this E, it would be a third, but it's all the way down here. All right. F up to A, also a tenth. G up to B, also a tenth. Here we have E up to C. You have to simplify because it's greater than a tenth. So E up to C, E, F, G, A, B, C. E, F, G, A, B, C. Here we have A up to E. I'm sorry, A up to C. A up to C is a tenth. Again, good. Here we have G up to E. Yep. We have E up to G. Tenth. We have F up to F. Octave. We have E up to G. tenth. We have D up to B. You have to simplify this one. It's a sixth. And lastly, we have C up to C. It's 2 octaves, but it's greater than a tenth, so we can just write 8 and simplify it. All right, so we have that done. Let's identify the type of motion between each one. Here, both lines move up and we keep the interval of a tenth. What motion is this? Parallel motion. All right, both lines move up again. We keep that same interval. Parallel motion. Our interval changes. Our bottom line moves down. Our top line moves up. Contrary motion. Here, we have a note that stays the same. Oblique motion. Next up, both lines move down, but the interval changes, so it's similar. Good. Next up, our top line moves up, our bottom line moves down. Contrary. Bottom line moves down, top line moves up. Contrary. Top line moves up, bottom line moves down. Contrary. We have bottom line moves down, top line moves up. Contrary. And then contrary again. So, is this wrong, the counterpoint that was written? Are all of the intervals consonant? All of the intervals are consonant, so that's good. Is it mostly stepwise or disjunct motion? It's mostly disjunct motion. Mostly everything is going to be a skip or a leap. So that makes it a little bit less strong. Oh, wow. I don't know if that, I think that's just for the footrest. So we're gonna talk about a few more rules in just a second, but from what we've learned so far, this is not wrong. It's just not as strong as it could be. The perfect fourth is treated as a dissonance when it appears harmonically between the lowest voice and any upper voice, but it is considered a consonant melodic interval. All right, so if there's a fourth stacked on top of each other, it's technically considered a dissonant in first species counterpoint. However, if you're going in one line, like if your counterpoint is a B up to an F, that's a fourth, right? That's okay because it's melodic, not harmonic. They're not stacked. All right. When writing counterpoint in only 2 parts, you should treat the harmonic perfect fourth as a dissonance. A perfect unison makes 2 lines sound like one, which can cause the sense of forward motion to stop. So the perfect unison should only occur at the beginning or the end. So if you put it in the middle, that kind of forward motion that keeps the line moving forward and propelling, it brings it to a halting stop. So you only want to use unisons at the beginning or the end. You want to avoid writing a perfect octave too often in the middle of a piece, as it sounds hollow and lacks harmony, right? An octave is just the same notes in different spots. There's really no harmony happening there. To the ear, it's not that exciting, so you want to avoid using that in the middle of a piece, all right? The perfect fifth can also sound hollow, as it implies a triad with an unknown quality because the third of the triad is not there. So you can have a root and a fifth, and that implies that there's a triad, but you don't know which one because that third isn't there to tell you. So perfect fifths are also kind of sounding hollow. More acceptable than an octave, but not the most ideal. Moving from one perfect interval to another of the same size is prohibited in first species counterpoint. These are called parallel octaves, parallel unisons, parallel fifths, right? So like I said, you never want to have parallel motion between perfect intervals. Contrary motion between two perfect intervals of the same size is likewise not acceptable. So if we look here, we have parallel octaves, both lines move up, the interval stays the same. Parallel fifths, both lines moves up, the interval stays the same. Parallel octaves by contrary motion. So here, the bottom line goes down, the top line goes up. We have 2 octaves still. The second one is technically 2 octaves, which is a really big gap between the voices. But because the interval stays the same, it's parallel octaves. So you should never have 2 of the same perfect intervals next to each other in counterpoint. And then here we have the same thing. The counterpoint below includes some errors. Write the harmonic intervals and then circle any parallel perfect intervals. So let's real quick analyze these intervals. C up to C is a unison. We have D up to D. What interval is that? A unison. We have A up to F. A sixth. We have G up to E. G up to E. G up to E. Sixth. F up to F. Octave. We have G up to G. Octave. We have A up to A. We have C up to G. We have A up to E. Fifth. We have D up to D. Octave. And we have C up to C, which is a unison. So, right here, both lines move in the same direction. So we have parallel perfect unisons. No good. This is okay because sixths aren't perfect. Here we have parallel octaves. Not good. Here we have more parallel octaves. Not good. Here, parallel fifths. Not good. This I would just avoid. It's not parallel, the interval's changing, but I would avoid having the last 2 measures be an octave followed by a unison, because again, the octave is just hollow, it lacks harmony. That's not an interesting way to end your counterpoint. So not technically wrong, but really not great. So now we're going to talk about a voice exchange. So a voice exchange is when the 2 voices switch, which has the higher pitch. Write the proper, so when you're connecting harmonic intervals, you want to write the proper opening and closing gestures. Watch for parallel fifths and octaves. I need to proofread before I do this. Write only consonant harmonic intervals. Avoid dissonant melodic intervals larger than a step. These are the most essential rules. All other guidelines are ideals rather than absolutes. So beginning and ending first species counterpoint, you want to examine the contour of the cantus firmus and then choose a starting interval that will allow your counterpoint to stay within a tenth of a cantus firmus while leaving the space for lines to flow without colliding or crossing. So essentially, you should look at the cantus firmus first, kind of decide the shape you want your counterpoint to have, and then kind of go from there. If the cantus firmus is the lower part and moves down, a unison opening could work well, allowing the lines to start together, then diverge without moving too far apart. If the cantus firmus is the upper part and moves down, or the lower part and moves up, use a perfect octave. So, Completing the middle of a counterpoint. If you have a leap, you want to set it up with a step in contrary motion. For example, if you're going to write a leap that's ascending, the thing that comes before that should be a step that's descending to make it the strongest harmonically. Steps may incorporate a skip or leap. Skip, you can set up with either a step or a skip. Lines should stay within 1/10 of each other. Octaves or less are ideal. So you don't want to have it spread out too far apart that it's greater than 1/10. So that simplifying we did, you shouldn't really have to do that, because to make it the strongest harmonically, you'd want to keep it with 1/10 or smaller. All right, 2 common problems include crossed voices and overlapping. So when you're working on a grand staff, right, you want to be careful of your ledger lines, because even though this looks like it's lower than the other one, if you were to actually place this where it actually is, it would be up here. So you want to be very careful with ledger lines. Forget about it. The interval has nothing to do with it. It's just the fact that at this point, the lower voice now has a pitch that's higher than the upper voice, and it's written down here. So it's just not good. All right. And then you can have overlapping, which, for example, would happen here, where we have a D that goes down here to an A, but this next note is lower than the bass's previous note. So to the ear, it's going to sound like this is moving down to here, which is not good either. So just be very wary of ledger lines in general, and that should help you with these 2 issues. All right, and that is it. Any questions on any of those rules before we start going over the homework?